Tell me about yourself is one of those questions you cannot skip in your preparation for any job interview, simply because it's often the first question getting asked, be it a phone or an on-site interview. So for today's video, I prepared a little framework to help you to arrive to the best possible tell me about yourself, with also some tips and tricks, and as well as some mistakes to avoid while doing it. And the first step of this framework is to brainstorm. Brainstorm for the 5 to 10 key highlights from your career. And the number one follow-up question I get asked here is, hey Dan, but I already spent 2 weeks building my CV just for that, so aren't my highlights already there? And my answer to this would be, of course, you have some highlights there, but the CV is actually a cold communication method. You just send it over by email, they read it, and that's pretty much it. When you have a conversation, a face-to-face conversation or a remote video conversation nowadays, the conversation is a lot more personal. So you would want to add a little bit of emotional element to the discussion. So besides, preparing your major successes that you already have in your CV, also think about some of the challenges that you faced throughout your career, because it's often the challenges that define us as a professional. So remember to have 5 to 10 of these elements that really defined who you are today. The second element of this brainstorming session is to find your core strength. Now, your core strength is that one thing that sets you apart from other candidates going into this job interview. For example, if I'd have to talk about myself, I'll talk about persuasiveness. And I'll probably say, yes, I have over 400 YouTube videos. I also have done some other things that I call myself very persuasive. Now, don't get demoralized if it takes you half a day to find your core strength for the first time, because that's something that's quite normal. But I can assure you that by the end of the day, once you have all these highlights and your core strength, you'll gain a lot more confidence in building a much better version for Tell Me About Yourself. Now that you have your 5 to 10 highlights and your core strength, the second step is to actually start writing down your first initial draft version of Tell Me About Yourself. And here, it's very important that you start writing down something that is somewhat linked with the role that you're applying for. So maybe just have a copy of the job description nearby. Now, it very much depends on the role that you're applying for, as well as some other factors. But just to give you some examples here, like, for example, sales roles might start with something more motivational, maybe something that inspired you to pursue this sales career. Engineers often start with their education, or more senior ones would start directly with their qualifications to do the job. Or who knows, program managers would probably start with an overview of their career and then dive deeper into more details. Some other differentiators here would be, of course, the seniority of the role, and some people prefer to write this down as an enumeration, while others prefer to embed everything into one big narrative format, that would basically include the main highlights of those 5 to 10 events in their career, as well as their core strength. And by the way, you don't have to necessarily talk about your core strength as, in my case, persuasiveness. I don't have to say persuasive every second sentence or so. I don't even have to mention it, but I want to ensure that my answer would transmit this message that I'm extremely persuasive in my quest. So you should, again, this second step is writing down a preliminary draft of this Tell Me About Yourself, and you could be anywhere from 1 paragraph to 1 page. All right, now that you have a preliminary written version for your Tell Me About Yourself, let's look at some of the most common mistakes that people do while crafting these answers. The first one I want you to consider here is it your true self that you're writing about there, or is it some persona that you're trying to build, a persona that you admire, or is it someone else, essentially? And this is actually a very important one, and often people, try to relate to someone else while talking about themselves, and this is, I believe, a very dangerous step. So if it's not your true self, I would say go back to the previous version and try to find your core strength and try to take it from there to communicate about yourself. The second mistake that you want to avoid here is to make it boring. Like, to give an example here, if you'd only talk about successes, chances are it's really boring. And even further, if you talk about your successes for 5 minutes, that it's even worse, right? You also must ensure that it's concise. Like, especially for salespeople, this will be very common advice that they can always halve their answers. If they really want, they can use less words. But usually, you can always be more concise if you feel like, you're talking for too long, or you feel like your idea isn't as crisp as you would have liked. Is it using metrics? So if you remember in the previous section, I said that some people prefer to communicate this as an enumeration of events. Some people prefer to make it a little bit more narrative as a narration. So if you go the enumeration way, chances are you're going to talk about some of your achievements or something that's quantifiable, right? So if so, then you'd want to use a couple of metrics because that will help the interviewer to better understand these things. If you go the more narrative and the more emotional way, if I may call it like this, then probably you'd want to stay away of those metrics, or maybe just use one or two of them, simply because the more general it is on the narrative side, the more emotional it gets. And of course, last but not least, does it contain your core strengths? Or, as I said in my previous section, if my core strength is persuasiveness, I don't necessarily have to say I'm persuasive every second sentence, but rather I want to send this message as my main goal applying for this role specifically. So now that you have something penciled and you've avoided some of the more common mistakes, time to take it to the next level. What if you take it and speak it out loud? Could be in front of the mirror, you could record yourself, or with a friend if you want, but the idea is you want to hear it. You want to get some feedback, either from yourself, either from someone else. And by the way, if you want, I also have a free role-play service in which you also can find some other candidates that you would want to role-play with if you feel this could add value to your process. It's a very important step of this process, and I cannot really insist on this because there's not much to say about it, but as a general rule of thumb, if you're not good at speaking, you would want to allocate at least half of the time that you spend overall preparing for this just for the role play itself, or for you communicating, even if you do it only in the mirror, but still half of the time it's that important to prepare for an interview. And maybe last, if you want to take this even further, I would encourage you to simply Google for what others are doing. And I'm sure you've noticed right now that I'm more recommending you to do this once you have the final version of your Tell Me About Yourself. And this is simply because it's a very dangerous approach that if you Google for some examples before you start your own, you'll be very tempted to mirror them in a way, and you'll fall into a specific format, a specific template, or even worse, another persona. And that's where the troubles begin, because you're going to gain a certain type of bias that you cannot easily overcome. So this is what I'm saying, that looking for what others are saying should be one of the last steps that you do in crafting the best possible version of Tell Me About Yourself. And maybe just as a closing note here, some people also prefer to prepare two versions of Tell Me About Yourself. And I know specific instances where in 6 rounds of on-site interviews, the first question was 6 times, tell me about yourself. So in such a scenario, it's probably worthwhile to prepare a shorter version and a longer version for telling about yourself. And some go as far as to prepare versions for Tell Me About Yourself, depending on who is interviewing them, right? Simply because, this can easily set the tone of the overall conversation and the direction that the interview will take from this discussion. So hopefully you found this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.